Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mike. Mike, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you on my show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, my name is Mike Griffith. I've been involved in JFK research since the early 1990s after I saw the movie JFK, like a lot of people. I was in the Army for 21 years. I was in the intelligence field as a linguist. After I retired from the Army, I was a contractor. I spent 3 years on Gitmo as an Arabic linguist. After that, I worked as a technical writer on some government contracts, and I'm a technical writer now for the federal government. And I must say, until I saw Oliver Stone's movie, I had no interest in the case. I just assumed, I took the Warren Commission's version as accurate. I wasn't really that fond of JFK at the time. And when I saw the movie JFK, it absolutely floored me. And I remember thinking, if half of this is true, I need to do some serious reading. And so I just began reading like a house on fire. And because I've always liked to write, I've written 6 books that have been published. Written a book on Pearl Harbor. I've written some books on the Mormon faith and ancient Christianity, and I've written 2 books on the JFK assassination.
Can I ask, well, before I even get to the question of where do you focus in the assassination, because it seems like every researcher has a specific area that attracts them the most. I find myself, for instance, being more pulled towards Jack Ruby, just because there's some MKUltra notes there. And when I say that, people go, yeah, sure, conspiracy. I'm like, no, the guy, Joyon West, who happened to be the guy administered a flu shot to Jack Ruby, happened to be the same person involved in the LSD experiments that worked in the CIA. And he was also the same guy for Charles Manson. So I like the MKUltra stuff. That stuff fascinates me. But when it comes to, when I was looking through the FBI website, I was looking through their government documents, and one thing that I noticed, it said platoon. And I thought they meant like platoon, like, there's just a platoon incident or something like that. No, I was talking about Oliver Stone's film. And then I had a buddy on here who talked to me about the CIA controlling Hollywood. And then I found files on J. Edgar Hoover and his involvement in Hollywood, a specific thing people can look up called the Hollywood 10. They had a file on Oliver Stone talking about how platoon was seen as a slight to the American military. And it was an issue. And I mean, we know that Oliver Stone had to go overseas to go get funding for his film for the JFK, which is a great documentary. But you start noticing that unless it's the official narrative, media really hasn't covered it over here when it comes to the JFK assassination. And that strikes me as an issue. And whenever we talk about conspiracies, I say conspiracies to a point. There are some that I can get with, and there's some that I just can't. But there's overwhelming evidence to prove that JFK his death was a result of a conspiracy. And also the same fact that Oswald, a 24-year-old, might not have been the person that killed JFK and was set up to look like the killer of JFK. So I want to know, what area do you feel you were attracted to when it comes to research into the JFK assassination? Did you focus on the Zapruder film, Secret Service, anything like that?
Well, really, I'm interested in almost every aspect of the assassination. I remember when I first began to study the case, I was struck that the evidence against Oswald seemed way too pat, way too convenient. Like he hides his rifle, but yet he leaves 3 shells in plain view. I mean, that to me, I mean, unless the guy was just a total idiot, which we know actually was very intelligent, that just made no sense to me. It's like that's really weird. The backyard rifle photos. I mean, he was the one who told the police, where he kept his stuff, and that's where they said that they found the photos. I mean, any rational individual, if you know that you've been photographed with a rifle and some communist newspapers, the last thing in the world that you're going to do is tell the police where they could, give them a location where they might find this stuff.
Well, I mean, even in the time period back then, and when I started noticing about a lot of like the FBI invading Hollywood and stuff, it was to look for communists. And it's like, it wasn't a good thing to go bragging around town saying you're a communist or you're this. And people said, well, he identified himself as a Marxist. And I'm like, yeah, but every piece of evidence links him to communism. Every single thing looks like he's a defector to Russia or he's some type of spy infiltrating America. But like the backyard photographs were the most like I didn't even realize it at first until Paul Blow explained it to me. But he goes, he's got the .38 on his side. He's got the Fair Play for Cuba Committee papers in his hand, and he's got the rifle in his arm. He goes, that's all 3 things to incriminate himself. And I'm like, look, I know today kids will take a picture in their backyard with a beer just to show everyone that they're drinking or partying. But I'm like, he's got all 3 things that could incriminate him in court on, yeah, he was definitely the assassin. But I mean,
and he tells the police where to find him.
That's the
yeah. He gives them the location, and they go there. Now there's a lot of there are a lot of problems with the story about how they found the photos. But that was a subject that I focused on for a couple years in the 90s because I was really interested in these photos, and I happened to be at a DoD station, and I was good friends with a photographic technician named Brian Mee, and he had many years of experience. And we sat down one night, spent several hours, and I showed him Jack White's video titled "Fake," and we went through it. There were several things where he said White was just, he didn't know what he was talking about because he was not a, I mean, he had some experience in graphics, Jack White did, but he was not any kind of a photographic expert. But there were a number of points where Mr. Mee said, well, he's right about that. I agree with him. And there, just as an example, the HSCA's photographic evidence panel, they admitted, well, it wasn't an admission in their minds. I don't think they intended it, but they were trying to answer the argument that had been made by some critics that the backgrounds in the photos were all the same, that they were identical. And so they wanted to disprove this, since obviously if these photos were taken in the way that they were allegedly made, with a handheld camera, where you're holding the camera up against your stomach and you're pressing down on the button, okay, and then you're handing it back and forth in between each exposure, all right, because that's what the story is, was that Marina Oswald would snap a picture and she handed it allegedly to Lee. He forwarded the film because she didn't know how. She didn't know how to forward the film, so he forwarded the film for her. He handed it back. So this happened for all 3 photos. Well, obviously, if the backgrounds are the same, that's really it's impossible. I mean, the odds against that are just fantastically remote. And so the photographic evidence panel said, no, it's not true. But it was interesting that they had, they said that after they did parallax measurements, which are really really, I mean, you're talking microscopic measurements on a photo, and they measure the distances between objects in the background, and they said that they found very small differences. And Mr. Me said, "Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. I mean, if this camera was handed, back and forth in between each exposure and everything, the odds that the backgrounds would only have very small differences between the objects in the background were really incredibly small, very remote. And so if you go into the HSCA volumes and you read the measurements that the panel made, or what they did, you find out that these were really very small differences. They were incredibly small, and so that's Mr. Me saw that as a huge problem. He said, well, it would be hard to get backgrounds that were that similar, that were virtually identical. I mean, we're talking about a matter of a few millimeters. Okay, that in order to get, I mean, you would have a hard time getting backgrounds that were that similar using an automatic camera, an automatic camera on a tripod, or just an automatic camera. He said you'd be really lucky if you took 3 photos in a row using an automatic camera. You'd be very lucky to have the backgrounds be so similar. And so he focused, he caught that right away. And then also like the line across the chin. Now the photographic evidence panel said that, well, it was a watermark. Now, that something dropped, some water drops or something. And he didn't buy that at all. He said, well, first of all, it's, he'd never seen anything like that in almost a virtually straight line, which if you look at the photos, you probably know this, that there's a discernible line across the chin. Okay. And it's about right here. And he said that doesn't make sense. And so just out of curiosity, I contacted, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 other professional photographers in the area. I was in England at the time. I was in Menwood Station, and I asked them. I described, what I was talking about. I didn't say that it was involving the JFK case. I just said there was a photo. We thought, we were wondering about it. There was a line across the chin. We thought that it might have been an indication of alteration, that somebody had put the face of one person on the head, of another. And I just asked them, have you ever seen a case where a watermark was virtually straight? And they said they'd never seen any such thing.
Well, see, that's the most difficult thing about trying to understand the photos being faked, because I think if you look at the people not questioning that, I mean, I don't think anybody thought that anybody would be doing investigations, or we'd still even be talking about this almost 60 years later. I think that's why they thought killing Oswald would wrap it up all nice with a fancy bow, and then maybe top off Ruby to make sure no one really asked any questions on anything. Like, why did a mafia guy kill, the killer of the president? He's not a patriot. But we look at the alterations of photos. I mean, we know Oswald saying that's my face, but those aren't those photos. But then you have a scenario where Michael Payne says, oh yeah, Oswald showed me those backyard photos, or showed me one of those photos one time, but never mentions it again. Where he goes, was he trying to go with the lie and try on his own accord without a script or something? I know people can bring that up, but it had me questioning, like, what was the technology to be able to manipulate a photo back then? And then you start looking into the process of it. Did you look into the process of it at all? Like, what are the specifics of how they could maybe pull something like that off? Because I think a lot of people would just accept it at face fact of like, oh, maybe they were altered, maybe they're not. But to me, that's a very damning thing if you start to question and look into it.
Yeah, well, and I asked Mr. Me about that, and he said it really wouldn't be that hard. And he said, actually, he felt that whoever had done these photos hadn't done a very good job, actually. That that they appear to have been a little bit rushed because they left behind some telltale signs. Especially the shadows, the variations in the shadows. There have been several attempts to explain those shadows. Now, the HSCA's photographic evidence panel tried to explain these shadows, and they ran into all kinds of problems. And at one point, two of their experts, they were testifying, Kirk and McCamey, and they were trying to explain how these shadows could fall at different angles in different parts of the photos, and yet they were supposedly taken at the same time. I mean, that's there are some things that can change, but the way sunlight hits objects and falls, I mean, it's hard to mess with that. And so they said, well, we were able to duplicate those shadows in a simulation, and then they had a picture of the skull that they used, and it ended up, if you looked at that head that they had the head turned at a very weird angle to the camera, and that was the only way they were able to get that nose shadow to fall in the right way. Well, of course, the head of the backyard figure wasn't, and he was looking almost straight on. And then it came up to the chin. The chin in the backyard of the backyard figure is very different from how Oswald's chin looked. And their explanation of the evidence panel's explanation was, well, it vanishes in shadow. Well, it clearly, I mean, you could look at the DeMornshield version of the backyard photos, that one. 133C doesn't vanish at all. It's very clear. And in fact, one of the congressmen, Congressman Fithian, even, he pointed this out. That, well, it looks like it's pretty obvious, and I really don't see the similarity. I see a big difference between the chin of this figure in the backyard and Oswald's chin, as established in numerous good photos of it. So anyway, so it's been an interesting thing to me. There's also now there's another issue, and that is that the rifle in the photos has a different strap than the rifle that was photographed being taken out of the book depository by Day. Lieutenant Day, there's a big difference in that one. The strap in the photo of the rifle that Lieutenant Day had outside the depository, clearly, I mean, and this is in the documentary, JFK Revisited. They have a really good segment on this, but that rifle had the strap on the end of the rifle, the handle stock. I mean the end of it by the trigger. At the back end, the strap goes into the stock on the left side, but yet the backyard rifle photo goes on the end of the stock. Now, because they had some rifles where the loop slot was in the stock on the left side, and that's what we see in the photo of the rifle that Lieutenant Day carried out of the book depository. But that is not the rifle that we see in the backyard rifle photos.
Yeah, there's apparently the scope grew by 4 inches as well too, but that would lead to the fabrication of where they had the receipt from an AJ Heidel that did the rifle order as well too, and that means that it wasn't the same exact rifle that they found at the book depository building. But one thing that I learned about the AJ Heidel ID was that they never found that on Oswald's person. You know, if they would have found that in his wallet and said, "Hey, he's got a fake ID in here with an AJ Heidel on it," there was none of that. So that's completely fabricated by whoever. I don't know if it was the CIA or the FBI. They fabricated that AJ Heidel ID.
Well, the police claimed that when they were driving Oswald from the Texas theater, that they found a wallet on him, and that in that wallet there were two ID cards. There was an Oswald ID card, and there was a Heidel ID card. Now there's another problem with that. I mean, there's a problem with that in that, according to several sources, including two FBI agents, that at the Tippit scene, at the scene of the Tippit shooting, that there was a wallet that was an Oswald wallet. Now, obviously, that that one at least was planted, and that's why they tried to make it just go away. But in fact, there's footage from WFAA. They were at the scene, and there's footage of the police examining a wallet right by the car, right by Tippit's car. And there were two or three people who said that wallet said that it was Oswald's wallet. And so obviously when another wallet, it turned up when they claimed that they found it on the way from the theater to the police station. Well, one of them had to go because that would really look weird if you had two Oswald wallets. Another thing about the backyard rifle photos is that in one of them, his ring is on his left hand, but in 133C, it's on the opposite hand. I mean, well, on the photos, in one photo, it's on one hand, in the other photo, it's on the other hand. Now, so what? Are we supposed to believe that Oswald, for some reason, in between photos, he took his ring off and changed hands? I mean, that's, it just makes no sense. So
someone tossed him a ring to whoever was playing Oswald's character to take that photo. It was like, "Hey man, put this ring on." I forgot he had a ring on his finger in the photos.
Well,
He's like, "Oh yeah,
sure." or
or
that the photos that they used a couple people to make those photos, and then one of them wore his ring on his left hand, and the other wore his ring on the right hand, which is still common today. Some people wear their wedding band on their left ring on their left hand, other people wear it on their right hand, and they just didn't notice that detail. Because, as you said, I don't think they expected the level of scrutiny that this case has come under. They had no idea. I mean, because as far in their minds, they didn't think that the autopsy materials would ever get made public. And that's something that I've also spent a lot of time on. It's really, I think that some of our best evidence of a cover-up is in the medical evidence. I mean, just as an example, just one example, you have on the autopsy x-rays, at least as we have them now, you have a very high fragment trail. It's almost at the very top of the head. And it's very obvious, you can't miss it. A layman would be able to spot it. But yet, in the autopsy report, he doesn't say anything about any fragment trail at the top of the head. It says there was a fragment trail that began just above the EOP, the external occipital protuberance. That's the bump on the back of your head, basically, guys. Yeah, and they said that the entry wound was slightly above that and just a little bit off to the side, and that there was a fragment trail that ran from that entry wound up to just above the orbit of the right eye. There's no such fragment trail on the X-rays. It doesn't exist. If it was there, it's not there now. And so, you have. I mean, you can believe that they made it the incomprehensible error of seeing that high fragment trail and somehow confusing, somehow thinking that it was several inches lower and that it ran from the EOP up to the just above the right eye, or there's some hanky panky going on here. There's something wrong. Now it's interesting that, and also the autopsy report doesn't say anything about this high fragment trail. It's not mentioned. And then you also have this. There's a 6.5 millimeter object. I'm sure you know this stuff too, but just for the audience's sake, there's on the X-rays. There's this almost completely round. There's a notch out of it, but there's a bullet fragment, or at least what appears to be a bullet fragment, has every appearance of a bullet fragment, and it has a little chip, a little notch that's been taken out of it. But other than that, it's perfectly round, and it's the most obvious fragment on the X-rays. It's also the largest, and yet it's not mentioned in the autopsy report. It would have been the easiest fragment to get because allegedly it was in the back of the head, and the later government panels that examined the evidence used that fragment as their basis, as part of their basis for saying that the entry wound was not just above the EOP, but that it was some 4 inches higher. Again, a staggering error. I mean, when you're dealing with a skull, you have obvious reference points, top, bottom. How do you make that kind of mistake? But anyway, and so they said, well, there's this fragment in the back of the head, and so we think that the bullet, as it came in, it sheared off, which is unheard of behavior for a metal jacketed bullet. It's unheard of. But they said, we think that this fragment sheared off the bullet as it was entering the skull, that it got deposited underneath the higher entrance hole in the cowlick, which again, if it were shearing, any shearing would have taken place at the top of the bullet because it was coming in from a downward angle. But they say, we think this is, that this is an indication that the autopsy doctors just made a bad blunder, and they misplaced the entry wound, the rear entry wound, by about 4 inches. Well, as it turns out, Dr. David Mantek, he spotted this right away, and he and I have corresponded a lot on this. He's really, he's one of the best scholars I think that the community has ever had. I think we're really lucky to have him, and because he's not only is he a physicist, he used to teach physics, but he's also a radiation oncologist. So
I
he
wish
thoroughly
I would
understands
have
it.
had him on later, when I was more like when I was actually where I'm at now, because I had him on in the very, very like second episode I ever did on JFK. So I didn't know anything, and then now I know so much now. Or I mean, even you explaining that, like it just what I thought would have been more conspiratorial would have been with David Lifton's best evidence, but now it's starting to become more believable when you start thinking they took bullet fragments out. I mean, there's just a lot of things about I can't get with the magic bullet theory. I definitely believe that there was a shooter from behind, maybe from that building. I think Roger Craig probably has a good example of seeing somebody up there as well too, with also the Rambler getaway car.
Yeah,
But I definitely think there was a front shot as well too. I think you can look at and this is where it leads into the Zapruder film, for instance, where people say it's edited. There's a skip in the film. You notice it if you're looking for it, but you typically, I mean, I thought when they meant the Zapruder film was edited, when they talk about the bullet hitting him in the head and it looks like he goes back into the left. I don't know if that was a front shot. I don't know what's a back shot. All I know is that someone fired from behind and someone fired from the front. I go by the witnesses that say that they saw it happen in a crossfire scenario. The one thing I did hear was a sewer shot. I was like, who the hell's firing out of a sewer? And then I realized they're talking about like a sewer grate that's by like where that underpass is, and it's like apparently against the wall or something like that, where I'm like, okay, that makes it more reasonable. I'm picturing like some dude coming out of the sewer like and but from a downward angle, which didn't make sense to me. But getting into the magic bullet theory and how like that, just I can't buy that, is that one bullet that comes out reasonably undamaged, remarkably undamaged, and goes through two people and makes 8 different wounds, and it's just perfectly preserved. That just doesn't. And I had Gary Aguilar explain it as well too on here, but he also explained the jet effect and how that's BS. I mean, obviously, if you're getting hit from the front, you're going to go back, and depending on what angle you're at, you're either going to go to the left or you're going to go to the right. But if you watch the Zapruder film, whether you consider it altered or not, it's still pretty damning that his back, he goes back and to the left. And it's just like, okay, so when we talk about a back shot, does that mean they say that a bullet went through JFK's neck and came out of his front, and that's why he grabbed his throat like that? I believe that for the longest time. But then I go, wait a minute. You watch it again, he obviously clearly just got hit from the front and he's grabbing his throat. Not only that, you look and you see that they stuck a finger in that little neck hole that he had, and it only went in about like the tip of your finger. So that couldn't have been a straight shot to his neck. That means that thing had to either slow down and hit something. And then that's when you get to the Zapruder film edit where you look and it looks like he drives over a sunspot and the front windshield makes a little flash. That's something that hit the front windshield. And we know because in the evidence that we do have now, when it went to the Ford company to go replace or fix up the motorcade vehicle, we have the windshield that looks exactly like a bullet hole just went right through it. So you start going, okay, so you start going like, okay, so the official statement, here's faults on this, and a big fault when it comes to just the assassination right there. And people still go, no, well, that's conspiracy talk. Well, I don't know what I can show you to make you believe. Cause I mean, right now I've scanned over probably, I would say 2,800 something documents. I've spent the past 2 weeks, like no sleep, just digging through the FBI files, the CIA files, going through the Warren Commission, going through a bunch of things. They're laying it out there. And I think it's just been over the period of time since the actual assassination that they've just slowly released a lot of very damning documents. And I mean, a lot of it shows you that, yes, there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. Just it's hard to get the public, talking about it and questioning more about this.
Yeah, well, a lot there. Well, just to get back really, just briefly to that 6.5 object on the X-rays. When Dr. Mantek saw that, I mean, he noticed other things about the X-rays that were he'd never seen in an X-ray. I mean, this is a guy who's looked at thousands of X-rays, and he noticed that there's this big white spot on the X-rays, unnaturally, impossibly white, about 1,000 times brighter than any normal X-ray. Of course, on an X-ray, white indicates bone mass. Okay, black indicates that it's there's nothing there. There's very little there, and this white patch is right. It covers most of the spot that a lot of witnesses at Parkland, at the autopsy, on the way to the hospital. It covers most of the same spot that all those witnesses said was blown out, was missing, that there was a large avulsed or blown out wound in the right rear of the head. And I mean, we have this from Clint Hill, who said he could see it as he was riding on the back of the limo on the way to the hospital. He says, he didn't have much else to look at, and he had a bird's eye view of it. And and then at the hospital, of course, you know about all the doctors and the nurses who described it. Dr. McClellan, his job, he was at the end of, he was at the head of the table, and his job was he was right next to the head, and he had a perfect view up close, and then a foot or two for several minutes, and he described it. He described the tissue. He could see cerebellar tissue, which is only in the back of the head, and any doctor who knows anything about brain mass knows that the tissue of the cerebellar looks very different from other brain tissue. It's very easy to spot. And of course, we know that the neurosurgeon, Dr. Clark Kemp, he said that there was a right rear wound. Anyway, so this object, Dr. Mintek saw this 6.5 object and was really curious about it because on the AP view, that's the frontal view. Okay, it's 6.5 and it's very noticeable. But on the lateral view, there's almost nothing there. There's a little tiny bit of mass. Well, that should not be. It should show the same mass on the lateral view as it does on the AP view, or virtually the same. And you notice that you can barely see it on the lateral view. How could that be? I mean, if it shows up as a neatly circular object with a notch out of it on the frontal view, and it has that much mass as indicated by how it looks, then on the lateral view, it should show much the same kind of mass. And when the ARRB, the Assassination Records and Review Board, hired 3 pathologists to examine the X-rays, this object really troubled them, because they noticed the same thing, that it's on the frontal view, but it's not really on the lateral view. And that's just an impossibility. And so he decided to do what we call optical density measurements of this area. So he could determine, he measured it on the frontal view, the AP view, anterior posterior view, and on the lateral view. And he got very different readings, which again simply should not be. When he examined this, he was able to go to the archives, and he was able to see the X-rays. And so when he examined this under magnification, he could see that this was a ghosted image, and that in this ghosted image, there were 1 or 2 small genuine fragments, because he detected them when he did the optical density measurements. He detected a very small amount of metal, not nearly as much as indicated by the object. And then when he looked at it closer, he could see that the object had been ghosted over this little tiny bit of fragment material. Now that fragment material also, and this is really important, does show up on the lateral X-ray. And so somebody saw this fragmentary material and decided, well, it'd be a great idea if we could add something to the X-rays, something else that would further implicate Oswald. And so they put this 6.5 object on the X-rays, and Dr. Mantek was actually able to duplicate how they did it. So it's a fascinating story. Okay, now you asked about the Zapruder film and about the backward motion on the Zapruder film. That's an interesting story. Now, Dr. Mantek has done some great research on this issue, and I'd refer you to his stuff. I'll summarize it, but basically, here's the problem. Yes, I mean, when you look at the film, you instinctively, when you see him go back into the left with such force, that okay, how could that, how could a shot from behind have caused that motion? Now there are 2 explanations that the lone gunman theorists offer. They're both just absurd. They're not really even worth discussing. But there's the jet effect, and I think that's been destroyed by a number of scholars, because
Gary Aguilar was on here, and he said that there's 3 nerves in the brain, and none of them would cause you to have the spastic reaction that causes you to jerk forward and then rapidly jerk you back.
And then yes, okay, now that's the neuromuscular reaction theory. Yeah, and both of those are just ridiculous, and it's really odd that a lot of the Warren Commission apologists cite the goat tests that Larry Sturdivant showed, but those actually they actually refute the neuromuscular theory, because the goat doesn't react anything like what we see JFK do. And then of course the jet effect theory, even Alvarez's experiments, once we got the raw data on those experiments, and we saw that those data refuted the jet effect theory. They didn't confirm it at all. And Alvarez, he misrepresented the results of his own tests, and then later researchers were able to get the raw data, and they found out that those data, proved the opposite of what Alvarez said. Well, now there's an interesting problem here in a way, in that so clearly the movement is back into the left. The problem is that not even an elephant gun round would have the energy to cause that kind of movement. It just wouldn't have the energy. And high-tech, way back when, did a lot of calculations, and they were pretty much right that they proved that okay, no bullet hitting anywhere in the front or anywhere on the head, no bullet known to man would have enough energy and velocity to cause that movement, that rapidly, of that much mass, because it's not just his head, it's his upper body, and it doesn't just go backward, it also lifts up a little bit. That's a tremendous amount of force. And that's what first alerted Dr. Mantek to the idea, or caused him to start to think, well, maybe the Zapruder film has been edited in some way, and that what we're seeing is not the original reaction, but we're seeing a shortened version of that reaction, and that the first reaction, the original, was a lot slower, a lot less dramatic. Now that would be plausible. That would in fact be likely, or it would depending on the kind of round. I mean, if it's a jacketed bullet, it might just go through the skull and cause very little movement. If it's a frangible bullet, which is a high velocity, and it tends to explode on contact, that could cause that kind of movement. Not nearly that dramatic, that rapid, but it could cause a backward movement. So that's what alerted him to wonder, well, did somebody somewhere along the line edit the Zapruder film? Now, I don't, I personally, I believe that the film has been heavily edited, but I understand there are many really good researchers. I know some of them who adamantly, think it's pristine, think it hasn't been altered. I think that the reason that the film was suppressed for so long was that even the edited version was simply unsatisfactory to the conspirators. That even the edited version, which I think is what we have now, but the Zapruder film, as we have it now, whether you think it's edited or not, contains strong evidence of conspiracy. I think it shows, and I have an article on this. I think it shows clearly that there were 6 reactions to gunfire in the Zapruder film. That there are, you can see 6 reactions to gunfire, and also, of course, you have the backward head snap. I think that they did that because they had to get rid of I think that you had a shot hit from behind first, and then a second or two later you had the shot from the front, and they didn't want to have that sequence visible because it would be obvious you got hit twice in the head. And that's why also something else that Dr. Mantek noticed, well, not just he, I mean, you've had a lot of people take notice of this, and that is that the spray, the explosion of spray out of his head vanishes after about a frame and a half. That's, a lot of people have done experiments on this. That spray, that matter that came out should have been visible for at least 6 frames, But yet it's there one frame, and it's virtually gone the next. And yet we know that the policeman and others riding behind the limo got sprayed with blood and brain matter, in a couple cases, small fragments. Where is it on the film? It's not there. You don't see it. All you see is an explosion of mass that goes out for a split second. It's there a frame, maybe a frame and a half, and then it's gone. You don't see anything going backward toward Officer Hargis. Officer Hargis said he got hit so hard by particulate matter. He thought he'd been hit. He thought he was a shot. It was that fierce. You don't see it on the film. It's not there.
A lot of researchers I've talked to have been agnostic on the Zapruder film. Like nobody wanted to touch it or nobody wanted, and I was just like, why? I was like, because for me, the Zapruder film was like, if it's edited and you watch it, and I've tried to watch it in super like times 0.01 slow mo to see if I could see a bullet go into his head or something like that. It's not possible. But what I do notice is that there's a skip, and that skip significantly changes the environment around it. You can say it's a crappy film footage, maybe it's old school footage. I don't know, because the rest of it came in pretty damn clear. And you got this one part where there's just a giant skip, whether I think it's frame 313 or something like that, that people mentioned. They mentioned the frames that they think are edited. I think they could be edited. I've heard some people say it's edited to the point where that headshot never even happened like that. I don't know. That's the part where I would land, probably more on the agnostic side. I definitely think it's an altered film, but I just don't know to what extent it would be altered besides a couple frames being chopped out of it. But one thing is, did you ever look at the pictures of there was a family that was on the that saw it, and it's a famous photo. It's like a couple guys taking photographs, and one dude's laying on top of his small kid, and they
Even the
actually
Newmans.
the
That's
son
the
of
Newmans.
Newman's.
Yeah, it's Bill Newman and his wife. Yeah, he was. It's interesting. He was an army vet. He knew what gunfire sounded like, and he told his wife to get down. And right afterward, he felt that the shots were coming behind him, and that's why he hit the dirt.
Well, that's why I said was interesting was that the media was right there getting a photo, like a Instagram, or trying to take a photo of their food. Where I'm like, they don't react like how you would if you just heard gunshot or something like that. And then someone mentioned, well, the media was just supposed to keep filming and be prepared for anything. And then I'm like, I know, but still, like to say to get the shot in a weird angle, to me, it just seems creepy. And then when I know what I know about Life magazine, for instance, and how big I guess that their view was back then compared to, like, I'm coming from young eyes looking back at what Life magazine was back then. When they bought the Zapruder film and decided to store it and not, release it to the public, for instance, until Geraldo Rivera played it on his show, you get into this area where it's like, what was the media saying back then? Well, and I listened to the recordings the day Kennedy was killed. I listened to NBC, I think it was, and a couple others that were going on at the time. They're about 7-hour recordings. Um, there was speculation that, president's still alive, going to Parkland Hospital right now in critical condition. All of them said that. They just kept talking and putting out this information where I consider the day Kennedy was killed probably the day you probably got the most accurate information, at least from the media in that aspect, because they probably weren't told to shut up or, line up with the conspiracy or with the way the Warren Commission was going. But one thing that they kept mentioning was the speculation of the rifle, that it was an automatic, and that there was this and this and this. And you start realizing, like, oh my God, they're so off from the main point. But it gets into this aspect of media power as well too. I mean, the media had a large key moment, and I've heard Oliver Stone say it was because they were scared. I don't think it's that. I think they had an agreement where you fall in line and you get good things, and what those good things were expert witnesses or people that were involved. You'd get exclusive interviews with, and we know from, I think it's Roger Feynman, who worked for one of these news corporations that exposed a document, and talked about how we would not go against the official statement from the Warren Commission. And to that, they were given expert witnesses and people that were there. But it becomes an issue because that falling in line and not criticizing your government has led to this overwhelming incidents where we're in today, where we can't trust our media. We're in this thing of, is the media telling us the truth on anything? How do we know if it's true? And it's just been a long chain reaction of events. And I think with the power of Life magazine, and also the number of witnesses that were coerced into stating something that they was opposite from their official statements. I mean, I've been looking through witness testimonies from Malcolm Blunt's archive. Thank you to Bart Camp for sending it to me. And I'm looking through, I'm like, these, like the bus incidents, the guy never talked about seeing Oswald on a bus. The guy never said it. The guy thought he was pointing out a teenager that was yelling out on the bus earlier that an old woman was having a problem with. The
Robert
FBI.
Jones. Yeah,
So
yeah, that
you
was Robert Jones.
so they
Yeah,
faked the bus scenario, and that's why I'm sitting here learning about the assassination from all the researchers, and I'm confused as hell, because I'm like, the parts that I have the most foggiest idea of what's going on was Oswald leaving the book depository building. What happened after that? I've heard he went to a boarding house. I've heard all these types of things. And where I find I have the most confusion is the aspects of the story that were fabricated to make a certain narrative fit. And there's just bits and pieces where they try to cut off every snake head that they could find to make sure that it stayed with the lone gunman theory. But I mean, if you look at the aspect of Oswald killing JFK, then getting killed 40 hours later by Jack Ruby was making statements before he killed Oswald saying to Jackie Kennedy that his heart goes out for her and that she's welcome at his club and all these things that just don't make sense. So I had to dig into Jack Ruby's character. Jack Ruby was dropped a club in his lap from his sister, I think, who was being sick. He took it over because she was in poor health. There's photos of Jack Ruby getting to know like everyone around town. And I would think, oh, this is like a mafia guy walks into a restaurant, he gets a seat pulled out for him. He's a wannabe mafia guy. He was a wannabe gangster. He would just knew people. He was friends with Dallas police. He was friends with I guess like gang connections as well too. But there's just so many aspects of the story that just don't line up. And when you start looking at the grand scale of these types of things, I think that when we talk about what's unreleased in some of these documents, it's a lot of information probably on Jack Ruby, and also the fact that, dude, they dropped off 3 caskets at it wasn't Parkland, it was Bethesda. They dropped off 3 casket at Bethesda, one at like 6:45, another one at like 9, another one later that night. And when I talked to William Law, he mentioned that one of the caskets that was dropped off, when they opened it up, it was Kennedy in there butt naked with his head wrapped. And that's when it gets into the fake brain scenario. Where did they get this brain that was grayed out, looked like it was in formaldehyde for up to 3 weeks or something like that? And
Yeah,
yeah,
well, of course,
I'm all in, bro. I'm telling you, I'm all in. Conspiracy.
Doug Horn has done some historic work on that issue, and all the evidence that you're citing is evidence he developed because he was a high staffer on the ARB, and he got to deal with a lot of this stuff. He got to interview the surviving autopsy doctors, a lot of the autopsy witnesses, autopsy photographers. He did some really incredible work, and I can't recommend his work highly enough. His 5-volume set inside the ARB. It's must reading. Got to have it.
I gotta get him on here. I gotta talk to him.
He's a real well. He, he Doug, he does not. I mean, sometimes he likes to take breaks from the case where he doesn't want to have any contact. So if you want to get a hold of him, I think your best bet would be Dr. Mantek, who knows him well, and they're friends. But they're, because I tried to get a hold of him a couple years ago about something. I asked Dr. Mantek because I knew he knows him well, and he said, "Well, Doug says he doesn't want to talk to anybody for a while. He's taking a break from the case." And I can understand that. I've done that at times where you just got to step back and go do something else with your life for a while. But now on Ruby, this is one area where I think that the HSCA, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, did outstanding work. They really, I mean, hats off to them. They developed a lot of new evidence about his mafia ties, about how he got into the basement, because it's very clear now. They really made a powerful case. There's no way that he came down that Main Street ramp. And so he must have entered it with help. And I mean, just really great work. And also now getting back a minute to the early coverage of the assassination. And it's interesting how this relates to the Zapruder film. Now, Dan Rather and Cartha Deloach, who was a high official in the FBI, they saw the original Zapruder film. They saw it that night or the next day. They both said that in the film, Kennedy is knocked violently forward. Okay, and people for a long time after the Zapruder film came out, they just assumed these guys were lying, but yet they didn't. Deloach, he gave his information independently of Rather. He didn't know Rather from Adam, and Rather. I mean, everything else he described, except one other aspect of the film, is accurate, and that is rather said that the film started as the motorcade turned on to Elm Street from Houston Street. Now that's what Zapruder said. He said he started filming just as the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, which makes sense. But in the current film, it skips the first time that you see the motorcade on Elm Street is when it's farther up the street. But anyway, Rather and Deloach both said. Now it's interesting. You had a number of witnesses in the plaza, including Newman, who said that that one of the shots knocked Kennedy forward, very noticeably forward. That's not in the film today. But I think that's what they had to remove, because I think he got knocked forward very visibly, and then he got hit from the front, and so then he went backward, not nearly as fiercely as we see now, but it was very obvious. It would have been obvious. Well, clearly he got hit twice in close sequence. And so I think that was one of the main things that they had to get out of the film, because that was way too obvious. But I just think that at the end of the day, when they saw the final version, I mean, there was only so much that they could do. There was only so much editing that they could do. I mean, I think a number of scholars, Dr. Mantek, Doug Horn, others have documented that they certainly had the technology back then to edit the Zapruder film. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so I think that, it's just interesting that, I don't think Dan Rather would have made that up, because at that point he didn't know anything. Nobody, at least nobody except those who were involved, knew anything. And now when Jim Garrison was investigating the case, some of the witnesses, I think it was Newman. Yeah, it was Newman who told him, look, I'm telling you, when Kennedy, one of the shots that hit Kennedy in the head knocked him forward really strongly. Now, after he'd already reacted to the throat wound. Garrison didn't believe it because it wasn't in the film. He just thought he was mistaken. I'll see what there was something else that you brought up that I wanted to mention. Oh well, I lost my train of thought. Anyway,
it's all good. I said a lot. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm so interested in the assassination. I mean, like I said, with life coverage as well too, media coverage, and then we get into aspects with Jack Ruby as well too. I mean, Jack Ruby making statements about, Jackie Kennedy, my heart goes out for you, inviting her to his club after her husband was just killed. It's just, there's a bunch of stuff that really doesn't make sense. But one thing I want to ask you, because being a researcher, one thing researchers of the JFK assassination will not even entertain me on is, did JFK really fool around? Did he have some type of some interactions with women? Because I hear that from a bunch of things, and I'm not trying to defame his character at all. I'm really not. But I need to understand this, because if that's not true, and then other people are saying it's true, I'm just trying to define what's real or not. Because if I get into a conversation with someone about Marilyn Monroe and they mention JFK, I don't want to sit there and go, it's a conspiracy. I'm not saying it. I'm not even talking about her death. I'm just saying, just known relationship wise. How does Jack Ruby not know any cops, but he's friends with every cops, but they say no cops ever went to his club, which I know is a fucking lie, but they say, oh, they never saw cops at Jack Ruby's club. Okay, sure. All right, sure. I don't think Oswald ever went there, but
whoever's saying that cops never went to his club, I'd be curious to know who that is, because they're really out to lunch on that one. As far as JFK's affairs, I think the evidence is overwhelming that yes, he had some. He had a lot of them. It's unfortunate, but it happened. In fact, Peter Janney's book, Mary's Mosaic. It's about Mary Penchant Meyer. She was one of his lovers, and she died under very mysterious circumstances. There are others, but yeah, I mean, I certainly don't approve of adultery, but I don't think that really has anything to do with the assassination. So it's something I don't talk about. I mean, if it comes up, I'll acknowledge it, because I think the evidence is just
for me, it was just details I needed. I didn't think it mattered in the assassination, but whenever I get into the JFK forum, someone always brings that up. Like a lone nutter will bring that up and say like he wasn't what you think he was or something like that. Where I was like, if this is real, I just need to know about it just so I can. I'm trying to funnel out all the facts
And it
here in my
bothered
head.
a lot of the Secret Service agents were very bothered by his affairs because sometimes he had them basically serving as lookouts, and they really resented this, and they talked about it a lot. If you read Vince Palomero's book, Survivor's Guilt, I think one of the best books on the Secret Service aspect of the case, because there's really some right material there, some really suspicious stuff as far as his protection. The story that he ordered that they didn't have anybody riding on the backboards of the car. They didn't have anybody beside him because he ordered them off. Vince interviewed dozens of Secret Service agents and others and some people in the Kennedy staff. Virtually all of them said they never heard JFK say any such thing. And what's so important about Vince's research is that he has a lot of photographs of other motorcades where they had guys, they had motorcycles riding on the side. They had agents walking beside the car, agents on the backboard. It was really common, even on the Dallas trip. There are photographs and footage showing this happening. And it was in Tampa. I mean, all kinds of motorcade, many of the motorcades, but yet in Dallas, nobody was walking or riding on the side. Nobody was on the back of the car. They didn't have the bubble top because it wasn't bulletproof, contrary to what some people think. But it was hard enough plastic that unless a bullet came in directly ahead, it could have deflected it. And there were metal strips that held the bubble top together. That if it hit one of those strips, it would have deflected a bullet. But also, it would have made it very hard to aim at Kennedy because if the sunlight, would reflect off the plastic of the bubble top, and that would have made it really hard to take aim. It would have just had a glare in your eyes. And there's really, I would just recommend his book because it's really.
I've had him on the show talk about it a little bit.
Okay, yeah, he did a tremendous amount of research on this. I mean, even Vince Bugliosi congratulated him on the depth of his research on the Secret Service. And I now just while I'm thinking about it, on the Zapruder film, there was something that I noticed. I think I was the first to notice it. And that is that Charles Brem's son, starting at frame 277, he's standing behind his dad, and then 10 frames later, he's standing beside his dad, standing there calmly, and he's clapping. Now, I looked at that, I slowed it down. I was like, that's like barely half a second. And that's way too fast, especially for a child who's he's coming out from behind his dad. He comes to stand beside him. He does it in 10 frames. And I was like, well, whoa, and so I did some reenactments with one of my sons, and I timed them. I had them stand behind a chair, and then I said, just walk, move from the back of the chair to the side of the chair. And when they did it at a normal pace, they weren't even, I mean, it took way too long. And so then I said, okay, try to do it as fast as you can, but you have to remember that you have to end up standing still, just clapping. You don't look rushed at all. You look like you've, 1 second you're behind your father, and the next second you're on his right side, on his side, and you're standing there calmly and you're clapping. And so he tried to do that, and he couldn't come close, and we did it numerous times. And I've thrown out the challenge on a lot of the JFK boards that, okay, if you think this is possible, if you think that's a natural movement, get a kid that age or older, have him try to duplicate it. You can do videotape it.
That's very interesting. I'm gonna have to watch for that next time.
Videotape the test, and if you can do it in 10 frames, fine. I think it's impossible. In fact, now that I think of it, okay, I don't think I was the first one to notice this. I can't remember where I read it. I remember reading it, I think, and then I looked at it. I was like, whoa, you're right. That's how could he, how could he move that quickly? There's another man in the film. I can't remember his name. I think it's Malcolm Summers. It's in my article. It's titled "Evidence of Alteration in the Zapruder Film." But there's a man who his leg whips in a fraction of a second, and I tried to I did some just home experiments to see if I could move my leg that quickly, and I couldn't even come close. So anyway, I just want to mention those two things while I had them in my mind.
No, those are important. Like I said, I'm trying to learn all aspects of this from the case and talk to both sides on it as well too. Just to try. I mean, I know where I stand on some things, but I think the whole point of this as well too, and much where you probably stand, is that when it comes to the conversation that gets done behind the JFK assassination, a lot of people intended for the same goal, but we find ourselves nitpicking over, like on the forums or something like that, over small stuff that necessarily doesn't really mean anything, but it's about correcting someone. And I don't know, I can't go 2 minutes without someone mentioning fucking, like, I have so many threads in the forum that'll be like an episode I did with somebody, and it'll be hijacked in a matter of 2 posts from somebody promoting their own stuff. And I'm like, guys, like, that's cool and all, but it's not just about trying to show off what you've done with it. It's also about trying to understand it the best we can and talk about it and hopefully get some answers as well too, because we're due answers. The people that have researched into this are due answers. The people that have spent 30, 40 years researching into this, 20 years, 10 years. I mean, I'm 2.5 months in and I feel like I'm owed a little bit of debt as well too. It's important, this is something where there's a very serious thing. And I bring up with Jack Ruby. I've been scanning through documents for the past couple of weeks now. I mean, it's gotten me gray hairs a little bit. I'm definitely hooked into it. But when I'm looking in and I see Jack Ruby, which I have statements and documents to back this up, there are psychiatric appointments that he has where he's perfectly fine. Every doctor's saying he's okay and healthy. Then after this one doctor that happens to be linked to the LSD mind-bending experiments of MKUltra, Joyon West, he starts having horrible visions of Jews burning in the street. And then I see his court testimony where he starts talking about they gave me cancer. Now you can link that with the conspiracy. That's even hard for me to believe. But what I started to notice something was when they administered him this flu shot for walking pneumonia, the same psychiatric guy who was involved in the LSD experiments during the Korean War would be mind or brainwashing people to forget the acts that they did over there so they could give a testimony and not have to lie. They just wouldn't know. And his testimony to the judge was like, what'd you say they gave you? He goes, they gave me cancer. I have at least 2 weeks and then I'm dead. You're talking to a dead man. That's a statement he made. And then the guy goes, why don't you calm down? Like basically trying to calm Jack Ruby down. Then not even in that 2 weeks, over a period of 2 weeks, they gave him over 126 x-rays. With 1967 radiology equipment, I have the document. I can pull this up and show you it. It is mind baffling to me to see over 100. I mean, there was one day that was 20 x-rays. Another day was like 6. Another day was 4. Another day was 2. Another day was 20. Another day was 16. I mean, we're missing a chunk of history, and that chunk of history happens to be from 1930 to 1950. All the people that just measured shoes to make sure they fit on people's feet, because the equipment they used to measure people's feet was an x-ray machine. They would x-ray your foot to see if your toes would fit in the shoe or if they were bending at all. And those people, most of them died of cancer because of the radiology exposure that they were being used to around being these machines all the time. So you're telling me in 2 weeks with 1967 x-ray equipment that over 126 something x-rays doesn't do anything to you? Like, I mean, that's stuff that I can say with anybody just looking into this or with basic knowledge can question some of this. I mean, that's my own personal research that I was coming across, but I'm trying to incorporate that into a later project to bring up.
Well, just okay on how the community, how researchers a lot of them, there's a lot of sniping that goes on. I try to follow, Ronald Reagan had a great rule. He said, someone who agrees with you 80% of the time is not your enemy. And I try to, I would drop that down to 60% on the Kennedy assassination, even 50. And so, I correspond with researchers who disagree. We don't agree on several issues about the case. Some, very passionately reject the acoustical evidence. I think it's valid, and I think that Thompson's book, his recent book, Last Second in Dallas, really makes the case ironclad, at least for the shot, the grassy knoll shot.
I got to get him on here too. I'm telling you, man. I got some names I got to get.
You better get him soon because he's getting up there in years.
But, I don't have I don't have anybody's email contact, and nobody posts these online. They're very discreet.
Okay, I can send you his email offline.
Yeah, read it on air. No, I'm kidding.
yeah. But I think it's very powerful. But and like we don't agree about the Zapruder film. I've got associates in the community who just passionately reject any idea of modification. And so I just I don't we just agree to disagree because we all agree on the basic idea that there was a conspiracy, that Oswald, most of us think he was a patsy, that he didn't fire a shot. I think that the recent Oliver Stone, his new documentary, JFK Revisited, does a great job of.
Well, there's two versions. There's Revisited, that's 2 hours, and there's Destiny Betrayed, which is 4 hours. It's a longer version of the 2 hour version.
Right. Okay. Revisited is the one I'm talking about. They do a great job of presenting most of the evidence that Oswald was on the first and second floor of the depository during the shooting. I think they did a good job on that. And Dr. David Rowan's book on the Zapruder film, he has a chapter in there about Oswald's whereabouts at the time of the shooting. He of course, you know him. He's a very careful, cautious scholar, but he is convinced that the evidence clearly puts Oswald on the first and second floor. But I can't recommend the documentary JFK Revisited strongly enough. I think it's really good. I put off watching that documentary for a while because I was afraid it was going to be like his movie JFK. Now, and don't get me wrong, I think on balance, JFK was a huge step forward. It was the reason that we got the ARRB. It was the reason that so many thousands of documents got released. But there were so many unforced errors in that movie. But I'm not going to nitpick it. I think it did a tremendous amount of good, in that it certainly, in its basic thrust, it was correct. It got some details wrong. It had some erroneous information because they didn't have very good advisors at the time. And Dr. Rowan, he got a copy of the script. He tried to tell them, I got a lot of issues here. But anyway, on balance, it's a great movie. And I'm glad that it brought up that it was focused on the case of Jim Garrison, on his prosecution of Clay Shaw, because for all the mistakes that Garrison made, he was, later, we have a lot of disclosures now that make it very clear he was on the right track. He was definitely on the right track as far as Clay Shaw and David Ferry and their managing Oswald in Louisiana. But I was afraid that JFK Revisited was going to have a lot of the same issues that the movie had, and I was very pleasantly surprised that it's nearly perfect. As far as I've watched it 3 times now. I watched it for the first time
Gotta
a few.
bump those numbers up, bro. I've seen it probably 200 something times, man. I was watching it, I think, every day, over and over again because it was just, it's so good. Yeah.
It's superb. It's really the only the only area of Revisited that I think might prove to be problematic or maybe just not as firm is on the evidence that the JFK planned on not only withdrawing from Vietnam but abandoning Vietnam, South Vietnam. There's a book that'll be out in a few months by a professor at the University of Virginia. His name is Mark Silverstone. He's done a tremendous amount of work. He got a hold of a lot of the JFK tapes that have not been exploited. I mean, they've been around for a long time, but they just have not been exploited. And I think he's written some other stuff, just very brief little snippets. But I think he's going to make a very strong case that JFK's withdrawal order and his intent to withdraw, he did intend to withdraw, but he did not intend to abandon South Vietnam. He was going to use the withdrawal as leverage against Diem, against the president of South Vietnam at the time, Diem. He was going to use that to get him, because he needed to make some reforms. He was, not a very good leader, but he was a whole lot better than Ho Chi Minh.
Yeah.
And of course, Bobby Kennedy, he was adamant that his brother was not planning on abandoning South Vietnam. He was not going to let it fall to the communists. And he was very adamant about that. And in fact, RFK, if you go look at the interviews,
I know that's coming down the line. I can't get into his yet. I had to focus on JFK until my project's done, and then I'm going to go into the RFK.
Okay. Anyway, but other than that, I think that Revisited and is fantastic. And just to follow up on the point about JFK in Vietnam, I believe he would have handled it much more intelligently than LBJ handled it. I don't think he would have made all the mistakes. I mean, if the conspirators, I think this was one of, I think they believed that JFK was going to abandon South Vietnam. I think they believed that. And I think that very well may have been one of the motives. But I'm sure they were frustrated when they got LBJ, and his handling of the war was terrible. I mean, he appointed a guy, General Westmoreland, who had very minor experience in leading large numbers of troops. He hadn't gone to any of the Army's advanced war colleges. He had no formal training in large-scale operations. He didn't understand counterinsurgency. His idea was you just wage a war of attrition, and eventually they'll get tired because we'll kill so many of them that they'll just give up. And he didn't understand. He didn't understand the communist, the North Vietnamese mindset. That they were willing to keep this up for 40 years. And so, Westmoreland got lots of troops, almost all that he asked for, and he squandered a precious 4 years of the public's support of the war. And there was a point when he almost had the war won, but it wasn't because of any action he had taken. It was the Tet Offensive, and that was just a horrendous mistake on the part of Ho Chi Minh, because although our media made it seem like a victory, actually the North Vietnamese got destroyed in huge numbers, because they'd always fought a guerrilla war. Usually they were not. They knew. And I don't know what happened, why they changed their minds, but they knew that if they engaged us in a large set piece battle where it was force on force, we knew where they were, and it was force on force, they knew they'd lose that. But yet for the Tet Offensive, that's what they did, and they got annihilated. I mean, they lost just catastrophic losses, and South Vietnamese realized this. They said, "Hey, they're on the ropes. If you go up there, do some bombing, cross that border, they'll collapse because they're just decimated." And now we know from records from North Vietnam that they were in desperate straits. They were horrified. And they were terrified at the idea that we would follow up on the Tet Offensive, but because you had this perception in the U.S. created by the media that it was some kind of big blow to our war effort. Westmoreland was just frozen, and he didn't want to do anything to follow up on this. But I mean, he was really a terrible pick. And so they got their war. The conspirators got their war, but LBJ, I'm sure they were very frustrated with LBJ for how he handled it. And there was one other issue that you brought up. MKUltra. Now I must say that until fairly recently, I would not touch it with a 10-foot pole. It just seemed so exotic, so far-fetched to me. But I've learned in this case, even if it strikes you as just flat Earth material, ridiculous, at least read it, see what they got. And so I read
flat Earth, but that's the thing. Is like, we know LSD has mind-altering effects on people. People have drug trips, and they talk about an experience that they can barely explain. It's not crazy to think that in the 50s, the government decided to look into what this drug can do and ramp it up to a point where it doesn't only alter your experience, but shatters your reality. And they found a way to use it in brainwashing techniques, and we have documents on their websites to prove it.
Yes. And see, at the time, I didn't know that because I hadn't read the other side. It just seemed to me so fantastic. I thought it was just, this is what makes conspiracy advocates look bad when they start to talk about this stuff. And so I was really hesitant to even look at it. But when I read it, I was like, holy cow, there is something here. This is not just wild, crazy talk. There are two fairly recent books on the RFK assassination that have a lot of information about this. And like you say, there's documentary evidence about this. And it wasn't just the drugs, but also hypnosis, where they were able to, this is documented where they were able to get, they had experiments where they're able to get a person to go do something that was against everything he believed in, and then he didn't remember it.
Including Joyon West, who hypnotized a military man who raped and murdered a 3-year-old girl. And the guy worked for our military, got taken to a sheriff's department after it happened, then picked up by a military, brought to their base, and then dropped right back off at the sheriff's office. And you can't fucking question that.
Yeah, and so Lisa Pease's book on the RFK case is really, I don't know her. I know of her. I think we've exchanged some emails way back when, but I've always respected her. And so when I saw her book come out, and I saw the subject, I was like, oh, Lisa, oh no. But I said, you know what? I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it. I want to see what it says, because Lisa's a serious person, and she does her homework. And I was just like, I was a little bit floored. Like, holy cow, this is not crazy talk. It's based on pretty good evidence. And so in fact, on my website on the RFK case, I have links to her book and a few of the others. And there was one very well-known psychiatrist or psychologist. He was like Harvard, one of the leading experts in hypnosis and all this stuff. And he spent a lot of time with Sirhan. And he concluded that Sirhan had been hypnotized and brainwashed.
That's Joyon West.
Huh?
Joy on West, the guy I mentioned earlier. That's Joy on West.
No, it's
Unless you're talking about Sidney Gottlieb or you're talking about Frank Olson. There's only three of the
hold on.
guys.
Yeah, give me just a second here. I will find it.
Frank Olson worked under Joy on West and also Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the MKUltra project. And a week before he died, he talked about they're going to kill me. And then he dies of a drug overdose by falling out of an 11-story building that he was invited to go meet a bunch of contacts at. I'm just saying, like, there's weird shit, and like you got to question it.
I got his name. It was Dr. Daniel Brown of Harvard University. He tested and interviewed Sirhan for years, and I'm reading off my site, and concluded that Sirhan was hypno-programmed to fire at RFK, and that this was why Sirhan had no memory of shooting RFK, and why he could not remember several key periods of time leading up to the assassination. So anyway, so yes, so my mind has been changed on that one. I haven't included it in my writings yet, although it is on my RFK site, because I think Sirhan, I think there's really credible evidence that he was hypno-programmed, and I don't think he fired any of the shots that hit RFK. You've probably read a little bit about this, and the autopsy report really makes it clear that Sirhan's gun could not have been the one that fired those shots. But anyway, that's the RFK case. So we'll get back to the JFK case. So anyway, yes, I try not to be one of those researchers who nitpicks other people's work and who takes my way or the highway view. Now it's interesting that you mentioned you're going to have Gerald Posner. I wrote a book length, a reply to Posner's book. Mine is titled Hasty Judgment, and it's a book length reply to his book. It's free. It's in PDF, and I don't charge anything. It's free. You can it's there among my research articles, and I go through his book almost step by step. And also in that book, I include my interview with Brian Mee, the photographic technician whom I interviewed about the backyard rifle photos. My whole interview, most of it is in there. The transcript is in there as an appendix.
Well, where can people find your links, Mike, while we're wrapping up here, man?
Okay. I recently moved my site because my old host, I thought it was going to be a reliable, stable host. It was Arvix. Hate to give them bad press, but they've ended up, they have issues. They don't support their own authoring software anymore. You have to use third party and that kind of stuff. So I have moved my old site is still up. It's going to be up until for another few months. It's Mike T. Griffith, MIKETGriffith.com. If you go there, that'll take you to my homepage, and then on my homepage there's a link to my JFK site. Now the new address for my JFK site, let me get it for you, because I'm moving my site over to Google Sites, because of course it's Google and they're very reliable. So let me get that. Okay, it's a little bit long, but it's not hard. It's just at sites, sites.google.com/view/JFK assassination website. It's all one word, JFK assassination website /home. That's the new address of my JFK site. Now, if you go to my old site, I can't edit the front page of my old site. That's part of the reason I'm moving, because they're just having issues. So, but on all my sub pages on my old site, I have notices that my page is moving, and I give this new address therein, and so that's where they can find it.
I'll make sure I link all your links in the description, man. They don't, they're gonna hear it, but then I'm gonna make sure I link it in so people can just click it as well too. So it's simple and easy. But Mike, I appreciate the time you've given me to be able to chat on this, and learn a little bit more through your research as well too. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.